The new TCPA one-to-one consent rules are here. That's why in this video, I'm going to show you the fastest and easiest ways to capture your leads compliantly without spending hours reading confusing legal blogs, taking risky guesses about how to implement it, ignoring it altogether, or without seeing your conversion rates plummet based on how it's implemented into your lead capture process. Now, please forgive me for the kind of sensationalized clickbaity headline of Emergency Webclass, but for many people, this kind of is an emergency. So I've been in the weeds with lead generators, performance marketers, and agencies for the last 2+ months discussing TCPA one-to-one consent and how to implement it into lead capture forms and funnels and landing pages to capture leads compliantly. And based on what I'm hearing, it sounds like only about 10 to 20% of people actually are thinking about this and have a solution figured out. So for many people, this might be a little bit of an emergency as you need to kind of figure out what TCPA one-to-one consent is and how to actually implement that into your lead capture forms. But for those of you who have figured this out or are working on a solution, you're in a pretty good position. For those of you who have not figured this out or don't even know what any of this crazy stuff is, don't worry, you're going to learn exactly what to do in this web class today. Let's just start with the current situation. The new TCPA one-to-one consent rules are here, and this is really going to impact how you capture leads with your lead capture forms and funnels. So basically, if your lead capture forms and funnels aren't compliant, you're facing all the scary stuff like potential TCPA fines, costly litigation, potentially losing clients to competitors who have figured this out, especially in many highly regulated industries where TCPA one-to-one consent compliance will be mandatory by clients. And also, if you're on the lead seller side, losing lead buyers who are turning elsewhere to people who have figured this out. I don't mean to try to scare you and be all doom and gloom. We're about to get way more positive throughout the rest of this web class. The whole point of this slide is just to highlight why we're spending so much time on this and how important it is for you to solve this problem. The good news here is that it's an easy fix if you know what to do, and that's why we're on this web class today. So another thing that I just want you to keep in mind as you're setting up all this compliance stuff in your lead capture forms and funnels is that it's really about so much more than just compliance. It's about avoiding a conversion loss as well. So in speaking with a number of people across the lead generation space, I've heard that some are expecting a potential conversion loss of potentially like 10, 15, 20% or more based on how they have to implement this. So these new compliance updates could unfortunately have a potential impact on your conversion rates, which will then potentially increase your CPLs and impact your ROI. But the good news here is that if you approach your setup the right way, then you could potentially do a number of things to mitigate a potential conversion loss. Now, I don't usually do a lot of talking, so I have to turn to the red solo cup here. If you're wondering what's in this, it's water, or as we say in Philly, water. It's not vodka if you think I'm sitting here drinking, although while working on all this TCPA one-to-one consent stuff, it's been really tempting just to pound shots of vodka, but just keeping it clean and drinking water as we work through this presentation here. So who am I and why should you even listen to me talk about TCPA one-to-one consent? Well, I'm the founder of Lead Capture.io, and over the last 5 years, I've worked with, thousands of performance marketers, agencies, lead generators, and so on to capture millions of qualified leads and doing so compliantly. And more recently, I've spent the last 2 to 3 months speaking with many high-volume lead generators, many of whom are agencies or lead sellers who are figuring out how to tackle TCPA compliance head-on for Lead Capture.io and even other solutions. But I've spent a lot of time thinking about this. I've spent a lot of time building solutions around this. So this obviously is not legal advice, but I've done the hard work to really figure out what to do here. And you're going to be getting a perspective of somebody who is in lead gen and who has worked with a lot of lead generators to figure this out. So let's just dive into some of the questions that I'm hearing from people just like you. And this will frame up a lot of what we're going to be discussing throughout this presentation. The first is, does TCPA one-to-one consent even apply to me? The second is, how do I update my lead capture forms and workflow to stay compliant? The next is, do I really need checkboxes if I have to send leads to multiple buyers or companies? The next question is, if you kind of look over to the right, how do I tag and store consent correctly? Now you might be thinking, tag and store consent, what's this guy talking about? Well, the main thing to note, and we'll touch on this later, is that TCPA one-to-one consent is about so much more than just checking a box. You have to store it and retain it, and then you need to also pass it through to either yourself, your clients, your buyers. We can talk about that later. The next thing is, and this is a really big question and something that we've been working on at Lead Capture.io, is what if I need to dynamically add companies to my lead capture forms from my lead distribution tools or my CRMs? It's a really tough problem to solve, but we made it easy, and I'll show you how to do that. The final big question, and actually it's not really the final question because there's many more that are coming up, but one of the other common ones that I'm hearing is, how do I prevent my conversion rates from tanking when I implement all of this? Imagine that you have to implement 3 or 4 checkboxes because maybe you're distributing leads to 3 or 4 different people. That could potentially cause a conversion problem. We'll talk about how to reduce risk of conversion rates dropping and potentially blowing up CPLs because nobody ever wants that. So don't worry, I'm going to answer all these questions plus many more throughout this presentation, and I'll even show you exactly what to do. So if you stick around until the end, you're going to get ready to use templates, giving you exactly what to say in your lead capture forms in your TCPA consent area. I'm also going to give you a TCPA compliance checklist. There's at least 14 plus different requirements according to the FCC around what you need to say in your forms, how to say it, how to capture the consent, what to do with the consent, and I'll just give you that whole list. Then you're also going to get best practices for implementing this without a major drop in conversion rates. I'll show you a perfect template that you can use for this. And you can just take this template and set it up across wherever you build your current lead capture forms and funnels. And then finally, we'll discuss how you can get help setting all this up if you need help with all that. Now, first, you might be wondering, wait, does this even apply to me? So there's a lot to unpack there, and I'm not going to spend too much time on that. Really short version of it is that if you're capturing leads for yourself, maybe you're an in-house marketer, or you're capturing leads for a client or a lead buyer or even a partner, and they're following up with leads via an automated dialing system, an automated SMS system, or some other system, and the FCC is now including AI voice systems into that, then there's a pretty good chance that this TCPA one-to-one consent stuff probably applies to you. Now, here's something worth considering. Even if this TCPA one-to-one consent stuff does not apply to you, let's say you're following up with leads via carrier pigeon, you should still consider implementing some of what we're going to be discussing today, because over the last few years, we've been seeing the lead generation world moving in this direction of a consent-based marketing approach. And I think the FCC is setting a standard here to really be having a consent-first mindset. And I believe that this is only just the beginning, and we're going to continue to see consent play a really big role as we head more into 2025 and beyond. So we've talked about some negative stuff. It's really not all doom and gloom. Those who are actually taking the time to figure out how to implement all of this are telling me that they're doing this not only because they need to protect themselves, but also because it gives them a huge competitive advantage over their competitors. One of the ways they can stand out is by giving their clients or lead buyers vetted, qualified TCPA one-to-one compliance leads. I'm definitely seeing a narrative shift where it's going from about being more leads to, yeah, I want more leads. I mean, who doesn't? But I want higher quality leads. So the opportunities here are higher quality leads, happier clients, or if you're selling leads, happier lead buyers. So you can literally build trust through compliance, not just trust with the people who are completing your forms, but trust with your clients and trust with the people who are paying you money, which ultimately leads to better retention rates, more revenue for you, and a stronger business. You can get more peace of mind that your clients are covered, that you're covered. I personally know that I am sleeping better at night knowing that we just built a lot of this compliance stuff into Lead Capture IO, because the last thing I want is to see somebody get sued because they aren't compliant. And I also am trying to reduce risk on my side. So peace of mind is one that I personally really resonate with. You get stronger data retention. There's a lot of people I know who just capture leads, push them into their CRM or lead distribution tool, and then sometimes they just randomly delete them. Well, with the strategies that I'll show you today, I'll show you how to make sure that you have accurate records for your leads in case you ever, unfortunately, get into a position where you're dealing with a potential TCPA or some other compliance litigations event. And I'll show you how to go back and find those records. And then, like I mentioned, it's really just a way to get the competitive edge, especially during this window of time when a lot of people haven't figured this out. It's a great way to stand out in the credit markets. Before we dive into the solutions, I just want to give you a quick breakdown of what TCPA one-to-one consent is without all of the confusing legal jargon. Now, there's a good chance that you probably already know what TCPA one-to-one consent is, but a lot of the perspectives you probably hear are from the legal side, and I think that's great. Keep listening to those people. I'm going to give you the perspective of somebody who's speaking to people who are actually generating leads. And I'm also going to give you the perspective of what this means when it comes to lead capture. I see a lot of people talk about, okay, here's the 14 plus requirements, but what does that actually mean for you? So we're going to break that down. If you have no idea what any of this means, definitely listen up here, but I would also say then go and reinforce that knowledge with all the legal jargon blogs out there and maybe even talk to a lawyer. I would highly recommend that. So what is TCPA one-to-one consent? It requires businesses to obtain explicit, individual, and that's key, individual permission from consumers to contact them via phone calls, automated texts, and other automated telecommunication methods such as AI. If you're sending leads to buyers, clients, or partners who are using those communication methods, automated phone calls, it says phone calls, but it needs to be automated through an automated dialing system, automated texts, and other automated telecommunication methods such as AI, then this applies to you. Ultimately, what the FCC is doing here is they're closing what they refer to as, and I hate this term because it just makes the whole industry sound so negative and it's just a toxic term, what they refer to as the lead generation loophole. So what is that? What does that even look like? Well, it's basically the practice of saying something like marketing partners and then having a link that goes to an external page that lists all of the marketing partners, or having a pop-up that shows all of the marketing partners. That's what they call the lead generation loophole. Talk about a clickbaity, sensationalized way to phrase it, but that's how they're positioning it. And unfortunately, that's what a lot of us have been doing for years. Now they're saying you can no longer bury your partners and your buyers and clients into this blanket text. You need to have their names explicitly listed in your TCPA consent text or in checkboxes that the prospect actually needs to click on before you can submit the form and then begin to follow up with people. And not only that, but you also need to retain that consent. And as you can see, that creates a little bit of a problem because now you have to figure out how to get these names into your lead capture forms. If you're distributing leads to more than one person, each of those people need to be in your form, and you need to get each of those names in a very specific way according to their 14 plus guidelines. That is going to impact conversion rate. And that's what I'm hearing across the industry. And that's why many business models are currently being upended or changing to try to account for this. But I'll be showing you throughout this video how to potentially deal with the conversion side of this and how to get all this stuff set up. So what does this mean for your forms and your lead capture process? That's the side that the legal people and the FCC aren't really talking about. They're telling you what to say, but they're not really saying, like, what does all this mean? And very few people are saying that this is so much more than just checking a box, because you must capture the consent. That's the box checking part, or the part where you're getting the name into the consent section. Then you need to document that consent. That's part of capturing it, documenting the IP address and all of the information so you can actually prove that somebody clicked on that box or submitted the form. Then you need to retain the consent. And then you need to route the consent to whoever you're sending it to. So the bottom line here is inside of your lead capture forms, no blanket permissions are acceptable according to the FCC, and compliance now requires full transparency. Now, let's just get real for a second, because I know a lot of people are looking at this and they're like, this is a lot. I don't want to do all this. I don't have the time to do all this. That's how I felt when I first heard about this. And then I ended up spending months and months and months basically derailing our entire product roadmap to build all this to make sure that we're protected, but also our customers are protected. So I get it. But I would not recommend ignoring this if you're following up with US-based customers using automated dialing systems, AI voice systems, automated text message systems. I would not recommend ignoring it because the process for getting this set up is actually not that hard. You can do it manually or automate it. It's up to you. I would just try to focus on the opportunities here to really stand out and to separate yourself and provide higher quality leads to either your internal teams or your agencies or lead buyers. So let's just go to some examples. To the left, you see something that is technically not compliant. And this is using, again, what the FCC calls the lead generation loophole or blanket consent, where it's burying marketing partners in here. Technically, the text is pretty good, but based on the fact that it's using blanket consent, this is not compliant. This here is an example of compliance with TCPA one-to-one consent. In this case, you have each company showing up in a checkbox here. The CTA would be exactly what the button CTA says. That's a really key thing. You have the language of e-sign signature. You need that in there. You have how you're going to be following up with people, and then a phone number, and then links out to privacy policy and all that. You can also have the option for somebody to choose select all if you have multiple checkboxes. If you just have one company, you could just have one checkbox, or you could add that company to the consent text. Keep in mind, you also need to document the consent by capturing IP address and a bunch of information, retain that consent, and then route that consent to where it needs to go. So I know all of this is a little complex, and you might even be thinking that this is sounding like more than I thought to manage. How do I update my lead capture forms to be compliant with one-to-one consent? Well, let's discuss that in the slides that follow here. So there's basically 4 areas that you need to focus on. The first area is your lead capture workflow for collecting consent. The second is your consent opt-in language. The third is optimizing your lead capture forms for conversion so you can reduce the risk of a conversion rate drop or increasing CPLs. The fourth thing is documenting and retaining consent. Let's touch on each of these, starting with your consent workflow. Now, there's 2 things you need to consider. You need to consider whether you're capturing consent for a single company, maybe it's just your own company, or a single client or lead buyer, or maybe multiple companies. The next thing you need to consider is whether that consent needs to be captured dynamically, meaning you're pinging a lead distribution tool or CRM with some piece of information like a field value, or non-dynamic where you're just inserting it manually. Let me explain what both of these things mean. First, single versus multiple company consent. So the first question you need to ask yourself is, am I capturing consent for just my company or one client or one buyer? In this case, it's usually a straightforward process. The next thing you need to ask yourself is, or do I need to capture consent for 2 or more companies or clients? And where this gets complicated is, as I've shown you, it requires explicit, separate consent for each company or client involved. So let's look at 2 examples. This example here is for one company. In this case, this is the compliance-focused text, and it would include the company name in the text here. The next version is for multiple companies. And if you're capturing consent for multiple companies, this is a requirement. You need each company to appear in a checkbox, as I showed you in that first example of what compliance looks like. If it's hard to see all of this, don't worry. These exact templates will be sent to you at the end of the video. Now let's discuss where things get a little bit complicated for some of you. It's dealing with dynamic versus non-dynamic consent. So the example here is you may want the companies to show up here based on a value that you send into a system. That value could be a zip code or state. Then some logic happens on that system side to determine who to actually show in the consent section. And that's where you're getting into dynamic consent. So you have to ask yourself, do I need to dynamically pull these names, company names, or even agent names, if you're in insurance or mortgage, into my lead capture form from a CRM or lead distribution tool? Now that's more complex, and there's very limited solutions available that can do that. Many people are trying to build their own things and duct tape solutions together. I'll show you how we have solved that at Lead Capture IO. Or do you need to just manually enter them in? This is less complex, but the downside is that it's a little more difficult to scale effectively, because what you end up needing here is basically one lead capture form or one funnel per company or client. And that's what we're seeing a lot of people in the industry starting to move towards, because there's really not many great dynamic consent solutions out there. I'll show you how to do both methods shortly. Just to give you an example of how dynamic consent works. So in step 1, there's a field, maybe someone enters in state or zip, or you could just pull that in from the IP address. Then that information is sent over to the lead distribution tool as a ping. There's all this logic on the lead distribution tool side that happens. They pass back this JSON payload, which includes the company name, the price, buyer ID, a bunch of information that then gets passed dynamically into the consent section of the form. If for some reason no buyer is selected, it just shows default text. And it all pretty much happens in one section of the lead capture form without having to have multiple lead capture forms. Then on submission, it's posted back into where it needs to go, and all that consent information is sent out to who it needs to go to. That's how dynamic consent works at a high level. There's about 50 different edge cases within that we have discovered as we've built this process out. That was all about collecting consent. Now let's talk about your consent opt-in language. I'm not going to read through each of these different requirements, but as you can see, there's quite a lot. This information is available all throughout the Lead Capture IO website, and I'll send it over to you. You'll see this is actually coming from a lawyer who specializes in this. You can find this information over at tcpaworld.com. I would highly recommend reading up on everything that they have to say about TCPA and one-to-one consent. Now let's talk about the fun one to talk about, because this is where we get into like the weeds of conversion rate optimization. It's personally one of my favorite topics. It's a nice break from all this legal stuff. It's optimizing your lead capture form in your consent area for conversion. Now, in this particular case, we're going to go with the situation of having to pull one or more companies or lead buyers or agents into the lead capture form, because that's where there's the most friction in terms of potential conversion impact. And even if you're not doing this thing where there's multiple checkboxes, simply just having more consent text could potentially impact conversion. So this is still worth keeping in mind. There's a few best practices here that we're finding. The first is adding an image of a real person looking directly back at the prospect who's completing the form. This is something that I personally have found just helps in general with conversion, and it's something that a lot of our lead generation customers have validated for us. This really helps build rapport and trust helps with conversion. The next thing here is, many people aren't thinking about this, make your checkboxes really big. I don't know, and I mean, these could probably be like even bigger, probably 2 to 3 times bigger, but I'm seeing a lot of people use these little tiny checkboxes that are A, hard to see, and B, really hard to click into when you're on a mobile phone. And a lot of people generate leads on mobile, so make them big so you can just tap right into that thing. Another thing here is I'm seeing a lot of layouts where the company names are showing up vertically down. That's basically adding a lot of space to the lead capture form, especially if you're putting all this information above the submit button. Instead of doing that, stick it across horizontally. So this way, it kind of saves space. Another thing here is adding in some incentive text of some sort to encourage them to actually check the box. Either make it a giant red CTA or something that says, remember to click these boxes, or see if you can incentivize. And I'm not sure if that would go against some sort of guidelines with TCPA, so check with your legal team on that. But I'm sure there's something you can do to at least bring attention to the fact that they need to check one of these boxes, and maybe even explaining why. People like to understand what's going to happen next. In fact, we have found if you can explain to somebody why they're doing what they're doing and what to expect next before they click submit, you will see conversion rates increase. There's many more things you can do. You can add logos in here. That's a feature that's coming to Lead Capture IO, but you can also add a select all button where if someone chooses this option here, the fields would automatically all be selected. Now, the good news here is if you're using Lead Capture IO, or if you plan to use Lead Capture IO where all of this stuff can be set up out of the box, this exact template is available to you inside of Lead Capture IO. And I'll show you how to get all of this set up shortly here. But there's one more thing we need to talk about, and that's consent, documentation, and retention. So one of the biggest mistakes that I see businesses and lead generators making is forgetting that compliance doesn't stop at just checking a box and capturing that consent. You also need to store and retain the records securely, and you need to keep the records for at least 4 years ideally longer for added protection. This has to do with the statute of limitations for TCPA compliance. So the bottom line here is that without proper documentation, you're leaving your business, your clients, your lead buyers vulnerable to risk of non-compliance, even if you're capturing it. Let's say you're capturing the consent and you're doing all the stuff that we talked about the right way, but then you're not storing those records and you're losing them within days, weeks, or even a year. You're now at risk of non-compliance. So please keep that in mind. Here's what it looks like inside of Lead Capture IO. So you'll see here, as leads roll in, we're capturing not only the verification status, but we're capturing whether or not there's confirmed or unconfirmed consent. And for every single company within a particular lead capture form that's listed that needs consent, we're capturing that consent. Then we're passing that into a receiving system. We're passing that off to whoever is receiving the lead notifications. So that way, everybody's getting the consent. It's being routed to where it needs to go to, and also being stored inside of Lead Capture IO for at least 5 years with user agent, with IP, and when it cannot be manipulated. Someone cannot go in there and actually change the fields. Once it's captured, it's set, it's stored, and again, it can't be tampered with. Okay, we talked about a lot, and thank you so much for sticking with me up to this point. The big question is, how do you implement all of this inside of your lead capture forms? And that's what I'm going to show you now, so let's just jump into the Lead Capture IO platform. So I'm inside of Lead Capture IO now, and at a real high level, it's a lead capture platform that helps you capture leads compliantly by building high converting lead capture forms and funnels that can be embedded into any landing page or website. We have features like built-in lead verification, compliance-focused features, and so much more. When it comes to creating a lead capture form or funnel here, you'll see that we have a number of different templates that you can choose from across a wide range of industries. So let's just dive into an example here. So you'll see that there's a list of steps. I'm just highlighting this just to give you some context into how the setup works. So when it comes to TCPA one-to-one consent, you're going to need to add it to wherever your form has a phone field. In this particular situation, it's on a contact step where I'm collecting contact information after pre-qualifying the lead based on a number of questions. And you'll see here, the compliance text is all inserted here. I'm following the conversion best practices that I highlighted in the presentation. I have a picture of a real person. This is Caitlin actually from Lead Capture IO. And then we also have the incentive text. We're making the checkboxes rather large, and we also have the select all link here. Now, let me show you how to adjust all of this manually and set it all up by hand before we touch on the dynamic consent part. So when it comes to manual setup, there's this section on the left-hand side of our lead capture form builder called TCPA one-to-one consent. If we just jump down here and expand this section, you'll see that we have templates. So one of the nice things about what we've built at Lead Capture is that we have these ready-to-go templates for you right out of the box. Now, this is the first version of this feature. In future versions, we're going to have even more templates that A, work for other compliance situations, and B, you could even add your own templates in and save your own template library of consent text. This makes it really easy to ensure that your text is always going to be optimized with the right legally approved language. And you'll see here that we currently have language for a situation where you need to capture consent for multiple companies, and you can easily add each checkbox in. So if you need it one checkbox, you could add that in. You'll see test, this would be company or agent name 2, agent name 3. So you could add 1 or more. You can add 10, you can add 20, you can add as many as you need. We also have a template for single company consent, where let's say maybe you don't want the checkboxes. You just flip on single company consent, and then you can modify the language in there and insert the company name manually. So if you have a situation where you're setting all this up manually, maybe making one landing page or funnel per client or per lead buyer or per company, then you can get all this easily set up with just a few clicks. The other thing to note is that we give you control over the styling of the section. Want it above the button? Just click over button. And now this information is appearing above your button. Do you want the font weight much stronger? You can make it more bold, and this is something you could test. What happens if you make the text really dark bold? Does that increase conversion rates? Will people see it more? We give you the flexibility here to control all sections of this. As I mentioned, one of the things I recommend is changing the text box size. Let's say you want it to 35 pixels. Let's see how this looks. I've never tested it. It's much larger. This, I guarantee you, will probably convert higher on mobile because it's so big, and higher on desktop because you can't miss the checkboxes at this point. Here's how most people put it. 5, maybe not that bad. Let's say 10. I do see it that small. 15. Now compare that to 20, to 30. You can see that this obviously will convert higher. It's one of those little things you can play with. If you need it to be vertical, you can even adjust all that. So you have control over a lot of the stuff, making your process of setting up TCPA one-to-one consent super easy, and it will ultimately save you a whole ton of time with managing your lead capture workflow and setup, especially if you have to do this repeatedly across a number of different partners, clients, and lead buyers. In fact, once you get this set up once, you can come right up here and click clone and continue cloning these across all of your different funnels. It's really that easy. The next thing to highlight here is that all the stuff we've talked about up to this point where I'm showing you how to set all this up is all about the implementation for how you'll capture the consent. But don't forget, you also need to retain that consent and pass that consent through to whoever is receiving the lead. In most cases, people are sending this information into their CRM or lead distribution tool. Well, we made that process easy as well. And the way you do that is by going down here to TCPA webhooks, and you can set a field name based on whatever the internal field name that you're posting it into your CRM or lead distribution tool is right here. So you'll see if you're using our webhook to post information into a receiving system, and the field name is something like TCPA data or TCPA consent, you would just add that there. If you're sending it to ActiveCampaign, LeadByte, Leadspedia, etc., you can add all this information in here to make sure that this consent text gets to where it needs to go. Now, in a case where you have multiple companies, it would actually show whether or not consent was provided for each company. So all this is handled for you right out of the box, no having to go and figure all of this out or hire a developer and spend a fortune on having them figure all this out. But wait, there's more here. In addition to all of that, we have our own tagging system where we not only help you get all this set up and post it into the right place, but we also will tag the consent. So if we just jump out of the lead capture form builder here, now we're kind of outside of the form, we're looking at the analytics, you'll see a bunch of leads here. All this lead data here that you'll see is just internal lead testing data, so I don't expose PII. But you'll see here that we're capturing IP address, we're capturing all the lead details, including these consent tags. So as consent comes through, we're basically tagging the consent as confirmed or unconfirmed consent. So now let's discuss dynamic consent real quick. If we go right back to the lead capture form here, you'll see that all the compliance and consent stuff is set up. Now, let's just imagine that the situation here is that you have a lead distribution tool. Let's say it's LeadByte or LeadProsper or Leadspedia, and that's where you manage all of your clients and your buyers. And then let's say you want to dynamically insert the buyer name or agent name or client name into a checkbox or even into this section by receiving a field such as state or zip code. Well, you can do that. And the way you do that here is it's pretty simple. You just come on down here to dynamic consent. You flip the switch, and this gives you the ability to set up dynamic consent with LeadByte, Leadspedia, LeadProsper, or even a custom tool. You can define what fields you need to post in, and you can define all of the receiving fields that come back. And there's so much more that I could show you that I won't jump into now. But the short version is that at Lead Capture IO, we've created a way to be able to ping the most common lead distribution systems and receive a payload of information back. We then pull that out, we then extract that information and dynamically put it into the lead capture form in pretty much a fraction of a second, and it's all really seamless. Let me show you an example. I just took this and threw it on a page in Lead Pages, but this could also work for Go High Level, Unbounce, Lead Pages, Instapage, WordPress, Webflow, the list goes on. So imagine that you're generating auto loan leads and you need to pull in a buyer or a company name, let's say at least 3 buyers based on the state. So we'll go through this. And then as you'll see here, we have card, make, and model fields. This is all dynamically updated. Now on the next step, you're going to see the buyer names dynamically get inserted below the submit button based on a field value that was sent into the lead distribution tool and returned back into the lead capture form. And there it is. So then I submitted that lead capture form and all that information was posted back into the system. It was tagged as TCPA consent confirmed. And then we were able to tag each of the company where the checkbox was clicked. And that's all there is to it. Now, your lead capture and compliance situation might be a little bit different. If you would like any help getting all this set up, we're here to help you at Lead Capture IO. Simply just go and submit a demo with us, and I'm happy to walk you through all of this and discuss your specific situation for you to see how we could potentially help you with our solution. So again, if you're interested, go to Lead Capture IO, demo, and just submit a demo or reach out to me. And I'm more than happy to discuss TCPA compliance with you to help you get all set up without any hassles or having to bang your head against the wall like I did for 2 months. That's all. Thank you for your time.